Welcome to today's seminar. I think we're going to be talking really about one of the most defining issues of our era, about climate change, about decarbonisation, and effectively about the world that we leave for our grandchildren. But we're focusing today very much on the position of social landlords with the stock they've got, how they can address the challenge, and the kind of information they need to address it most effectively. So people are still joining, but just to introduce the technical format for today. Firstly, I should say that we're going to be recording the whole seminar, and the slides that you're going to see will be available afterwards for your reference. The event is being live captioned, so there's a button at the bottom which allows you to see the live transcript if you prefer that. It's reasonably accurate. I believe it's said to be about 80% accurate for people who wish to see that, but you can turn it off too if you find it a distraction. Now, the chat function is turned off, but there's a question and answer function. So please use that. Put in your questions as we go along. And my job will be to put them to the panelists and to keep the discussion focusing on the things that are of interest to you, the participants. You can like people's questions. If you like a question, it means I'm more likely to come to it. And if we have too many questions, I'll focus on the ones that have the most likes. You're not allowed to dislike a question, I'm pleased to say. And you can also comment on other people's questions. You should be on mute, please, but you should be able to see all of us. And we will do our best to answer all your questions, but if there are some that are unanswered, we might drop you a line afterwards. So without much further ado, we will get going on the session. I'll introduce the speakers one by one as they're about to speak. And our first speaker is Robert Kingsmill, who's a partner at a firm called RESAM, which is part of the Resolute Group. And Robert has been working a lot with social landlords, helping them to understand their portfolios and to be able to make the necessary decisions to begin the long journey towards decarbonisation. Before this, Robert's guilty secret is that he was a real estate lawyer for two of the major city firms, but we won't hold it against him. So, Robert, 10 minutes for you, please, without repetition, deviation, or hesitation.
Thank you, James. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining this seminar. And thanks for sharing the guilty secret, James, but enough said about that, I think. Decarbonisation is a very, very large topic, and I'm only going to try and nibble away at the very edges of a few small parts of it. But my focus, and I hope a conclusion, will give you perhaps some thoughts about how you can bring decarbonisation to bear in terms of a strategy and an implementation of a strategy over a period of time, so that you can address decarbonisation thoughtfully and wisely. I think we run the risk of sprinting very, very hard on this topic, and perhaps in doing so, making some errors, not least on which things like, what is decarbonisation? What does that mean for us? And I think I'm right in saying that Rose and Ted may speak about that a little bit later. I'll steer clear of the technical because it's not really my space. And as James mentioned, I focus more on the portfolio side of things. So I'll address two issues a little bit like the sessions you probably do in strategy planning with exec teams or the board teams. And the first topic I'll cover is the funding environment, because I think one thing that we know at the margins is that this is an expensive problem. It's an expensive problem for society, and it's an expensive problem in particular for our sector. So I've got on this page a few data points. They may or may not all be correct. I've tried to quote the sources, but when you look at the figures that are popping up on the screen right now, the scale of the problem is sobering. 2.7 to 3 million homes owned by RPs across the country. And one thing which I find really confusing and challenging is each article you read gives such a broad range of an estimate of costs for making the existing homes carbon neutral. So, and on this screen, you've got a quote there from an Inside Out Housing article of £2.5 to £50,000. So I think that is dictated a little bit by the nature of the stock, but it's a very, very big question to which very few people have clear answers at the moment. The government, as you can see on the right there, has made what on the surface appear to be some big numbers and some strong commitments, but in the scale of the problem, they don't really address the issue. Then on the bottom line of this, there is a few things about the current direction of travel in public finances. The figure on the left is, I think, the most dubious on this screen, because if costs only go up 16% in 5 years, I'll be delighted. And I'm sure pretty much everyone on this call will be too. Inflation, as we all know, is moving up. That is having very real effect on our residents. It's having very real effect on the labour force. And the column on the right, or the stat on the right, worries me in particular because I think government debt servicing has jumped, and I think that the figures I've seen is it's going to jump again in the next year. And you also need to remember that NHS costs are somewhere in the region of 170 to 190 billion. So we've just been through a major health crisis, and we're now struggling, I think, to make some big decisions as a society about where our limited resources are devoted. And decarbonisation, I think, is an important part, but it is struggling a little bit with the competing demands on the public purse. The next point I'd like to address a little bit is what I would call sector considerations in setting your strategy. The first point on this is that we have an obligation to our residents to provide good quality homes for people, and people who can least afford cost of living increases, who struggle the most with heating their homes in winter. And you look at the moment where some of the changes that are being talked about, which are very desirable perhaps, are looking at switching from gas to electricity. And that brings a huge cost burden to those residents. I think there's reason for optimism out there. And I think you look at energy on the grid, there's talk of hydrogen, there's renewables, though there's no talk about how one makes renewables work when there isn't sunshine or wind. Our battery capacity in Western Europe is at 3% of what it needs to make renewables functional. Heating, ground source and air source heat pumps are available. They don't work as well as we need them to yet, though there's technological improvements all the way. There's also a skills shortage and some challenges with construction. A lot of innovation in construction too, and I think in new home development in particular, that's an area where the sector can be innovative. And on the right, there's just a chart which was, I think, in Inside Housing last month, showing just where the sector is at the moment in designing and delivering their strategy. And it's interesting to me that it's nearly a quarter have a strategy that they're implementing, and then almost all the rest are at the stage of designing it. So to try and draw those two themes together and bring a couple of conclusions. The first is that I think in terms of the strategy, to rely on government funding alone is not a wise strategy. There needs to be some thought given to self-funding in whichever form. And the second, which is a little bit controversial perhaps, is that the technological landscape and those topics I mentioned earlier are all going to get better. And some of them will get better very, very quickly, some of them less quickly. So then that leads me to looking at a really big part of the challenge and how you convert that to solving problems in the portfolio. And this is a little bit of a pro forma, but I think most of you would recognize that we have in the sector and in our portfolios a wide variance of age of stock, quality of stock, cost of maintenance, and deliverability for that stock. So when we look at it, it isn't just about age, it's about The livability, addressing issues of fuel poverty. There are questions around what can you retrofit. Ground source heat pumps, you need space, which aren't often available in urban areas. You need also to look at the energy performance of the assets as well. And EPC is a good proxy, but it's not a complete answer. So the asset pool that each RP has will heavily inform its strategic choices and the right strategy for that RP, because there's a lot of moving pieces. So if we move on to the next slide, the way that we at RESAM look at this, and I think a lot of RPs are developing this thinking. So some of what I project here is a little bit internal, but I think you'll recognize again the headings. Which parts of your portfolio should you be retaining? The easy answer, I think, is EPC, C or better, good locations, usually built in the last 15 to 20 years. You'd be hard pressed to say you need to do too much. There might be some minor planned maintenance to do, but that stock is reasonably strong and doesn't demand too much attention. The next category is the stock that requires refurbishment. Now that needs to be cost effective, which is a question I've touched on. The next area is the redevelopment of stock. This can cover new homes, which I haven't talked much about, but I think that's a very good way of addressing your strategy. The redevelopment, if you have good locations or estates or blocks, you have the opportunity to really improve your housing supply on the land that you have, but it might require a longer time frame. And then the last category is there are just some assets which you may not want to own or may not make sense to own. And our view is that those are the ones that you should be releasing to the market. And there's a whole separate question around what does release mean and how should you do it. If you're transferring core stock into the market, are you really helping housing supply? And what happens to the stock once you sell it or you come up with a stock transfer or some other solution? You'll be pleased to hear I'm almost finished and almost on time. And on the next slide, I draw this together with an outline visual of what a strategic plan and an implementation plan might look like for your organization. And the key thing that I'd emphasize here is that there is a significant amount of work that needs to be done in assessing the stock and joining together the strategic issues, which I mentioned, and your portfolio archetypes and the challenges within the portfolio. Before then, I would suggest you would be looking to implement the program, take the benefit of the technology, and also provide some element of self-funding. Thank you for your time. And James, I think I get to hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. That's a really good start. I was particularly struck actually by the slide about the typical distribution of stock across the sector and the 15% Victorian properties, and we might come back to that. Now that we have all of the participants joined, I think we're going to run a poll just to see where people are at the moment. So we're asking you, you've heard Robert, you know what's going on in your organisation. How ready do you feel about your organisation and the net zero journey? So if everybody can just click on that, and then we'll see where we stand, and we'll probably run the same thing again at the end and see if you feel more or less prepared, having heard what Rose and Ted have to say. So we'll just pause for a moment while people do that. It says host cannot vote. That's not very fair, is it? Zena, will you tell us when you've got some results in? Good. So a stonking 2% of people feel absolutely ready for the net zero journey. 33% think they're ready, but well over half, getting on for 2/3 actually, think that they are not ready for the net zero journey. So I think that for me emphasizes the importance of today's seminar and for the sector to be talking amongst itself and sharing expertise, sharing experience, and looking ahead. So I think, Robert, we'll move on to the next speakers and come back to the questions. Questions are beginning to come in, which is great. So our next speaker is Rose Bean. Rose is the Executive Director of Assets and Sustainability at Abri, which is a relatively new organisation operating west of London, fairly substantial. And Rose is passionate about climate change and about tackling poverty as well. And again, there was a clue in Robert's remarks there that moving, for instance, from gas to electricity doesn't exactly help people who are in poverty, even if gas prices are appearing to catch up a bit with electricity prices. So Rose has had a lot of experience in terms of delivering and implementing change, and really introducing a new culture of low carbon thinking at Abri. So looking forward to hear what you've got to say, Rose.
Thanks, James, and welcome everyone. So today I wanted to focus on Abri's journey over the last 2 years in terms of developing our sustainability strategy and some of the key decisions we made around our approach to that. So just the context, we're about to launch a brand new sustainability strategy, and we're also an early adopter of the Sustainability Reporting Standard for social housing. So we published our first ESG report last year. So looking back to around 18 months ago, Abri's efforts and sole focus was on creating a phased approach to decarbonising our assets, and that was a fully costed approach at that stage. And I'll come on to that a bit later on. And like many others in the sector at the time, we were approaching this very much from the perspective of an asset management issue. And I think quite quickly on, we realised there are some real challenges with looking at this solely through the lens of asset management. And actually, we made a very conscious decision to rewire our approach. So we wanted to break the cycle that we saw in the sector around this predominantly being kind of approach from the perspective of the asset base. Now, I totally get that. It is without a doubt your biggest liability. But this for us was about approaching this at a more strategic and business level and treating our asset base as just one strand of it. I think really in terms of our drivers, we've seen coming through COP26 and government messaging very much the fact that businesses need to have a plan for the transition to net zero. And in the longer term, we know the mandatory financial climate disclosures are coming into play. And all of this really does require a holistic understanding of the risks that climate change presents to a business, but also a need to plan for that transition, tackling emissions across the entire value chain. So 12 months ago, we implemented an executive lead, and we took our executive and our board through an extensive climate change programme. So we started from the perspective of looking at the global implications of climate change, and we worked our way through the UK policy and economic landscape. And that really led us to a set of areas that we felt that our strategy should address. So first and foremost, it had to set out a credible plan for transitioning our business to net zero, and that had to be in line with science-based targets. We also recognise, we are talking about a twin crisis, so we're talking about climate change and biodiversity loss. So it had to address how we would develop our plans to reduce our impact on nature. And this is an increasingly key consideration for businesses. We've got the UN Convention on Biological Diversity about to launch a new global biodiversity framework. And what that's going to do in effect is set targets in the same way the Paris Agreement does for nations to protect and restore nature. The other key element here to be aware of, this is coming in the eye line of investors in terms of nature-based risks. So we've got the Task Force on Nature-Based Climate Risks, and they're effectively looking to heighten transparency on nature-related risks in order to de-risk investment. So all the way through this approach, we've got an eye on where the kind of financial markets are going and where investors will be looking in the longer term. We recognise that delivering a credible plan for transitioning to net zero really does include a significant focus on business transformation. This ultimately impacts every area of your business. And fundamentally, it drives a need to think about the frameworks used to assess climate risks and the standards you're applying to that. We also wanted to address the fundamental challenges that both climate change and the policies put in place to tackle climate change present in terms of inequality. So this concept of a fair and just transition was key to the Paris Agreement and subsequently, UK policy. But there are major challenges with current policy drivers and the impact on low-income households. So we wanted to develop a greater understanding of the implications and opportunities to drive greater social value out of this agenda. So just picking up on some of the specific implications of these areas and our emerging thinking. As I've signposted, business transformation is a really, really key aspect to this. In part, next slide if we can. In part, this is about ensuring your sustainability strategy has tentacles into every other functional strategy and business plan. So we're embarking on the process of embedding sustainability targets and aspirations within every functional strategy and interlinking performance targets. This is also about, how are you embedding sustainability into every role? So for Abri, we launched around 12 months ago our Carbon Academy, and we committed to rolling out carbon literacy to every single colleague. The next phase, back a slide, please. The next phase in terms of our strategy is really heightening our L&D offer. And the sector really does need to be thinking about how we address future leadership requirements in line with climate change. And we saw in the lead up to COP26, 8 of the leading business schools coming together under the umbrella of Business Schools for Climate Leadership. And they were really looking to implement a toolkit for business leaders, which was in part about what are the questions you need to be asking yourself in order to assure yourself that you've got a handle on the transition. But it was also really signaling the direction of travel in terms of climate leadership. So addressing competency both at board level, exec level, and throughout the organisation is a really key area of focus for us. I think we probably all recognise that a credible strategy for transitioning to net zero starts with a robust understanding of your full carbon footprint. So that's your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And I think, next slide, please. We're a bit out of sync, bear with us. And I think the point here, look, the days of creating a credible strategy that doesn't tackle the emissions not within your direct control are gone. Absolutely, the direction of travel in terms of the narrative coming out of the government is organisations need to tackle scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And actually, that's where the bulk of your emissions will be sat. So for us, 97% of our emissions are sat within scope 3. In line with science-based initiatives, typically you would adopt near-term and long-term targets. So for Abri, we've assessed our full carbon footprint and we've established decarbonisation pathways for 2030 and 2050. And I mentioned at the beginning of this that 18 months ago, Abri actually developed quite early on a costed roadmap for transitioning our homes to net zero. And we've just gone through a full reassessment of that in line with the government's heat and building strategy, and we've reprofiled our investment requirements. And I think the key point here is, and the challenge around this, is that the government strategy does internalise the decisions you make about the standards you're going to apply based on fuel poverty. So, there's an argument for saying actually heat and building strategy sets a reasonably low bar, which again drives that decision making around, okay, are you looking to maintain fuel costs or are you actively reducing them? And in the current context, retrofitting to significantly reduce fuel costs carries a massive, massive price tag. So I think it's a really key area to think about. And the final piece I really wanted to touch on is around risk and standards. So if we look at the profile of how climate risks of development, environmental risks absolutely dominate the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report for 2022, both in the short term and the long term. So climate change related risks account for 3 of the top risks by severity over the next decade. So the starting point in any strategy is a robust understanding of the impact that both physical and transitional risks associated with climate change will have on your business. And again, through COP26, we saw the UK government announce the direction of travel in terms of implementing a mandatory sustainability disclosure regime. So that's going to hit every business at some point. And this is all about bringing greater transparency to climate-related risks. It's all about de-risking investment. So as part of our strategy, we are aligning to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So that's one of the key frameworks that's likely to underpin the government's mandatory disclosure regime. Now, our decision for going quite early on that is twofold. A, we're readying ourselves for the longer term implications, but it does just really support good climate governance and strategic decision making. As part of that, in order to develop a more sophisticated approach to assessing climate risk, we're also moving towards climate scenario analysis. So that's all about testing your business plan in line with a range of future outcomes subject to how global warming is controlled. And again, it all underpins the TCFD recommendations. So a really, really whistle-stop tour there. I just wanted to get across actually the breadth of considerations that you might want to adopt as you're starting to move towards your strategy.
That's great. Thank you, Rose. And I think one of the things I took from that is that decarbonisation is not just a kind of technical task. It's about a whole way of thinking. It's about the culture of the organisation. And when we talk about transformation, it's actually, at least part of that is to do with this. The other thing that really struck me is your statistic, and I just wanted to check I heard it right. 97% of emissions are scope 3. Does that mean that there isn't much you can do about it, or does it mean it's slower? Do you want to say a bit about that? Because I thought it was really, really striking. Actually, that was a new one for me.
This will come down to how you account, but for us, scope 3 consists of our properties and our supply chains. So actually what you're saying there is that's where the bulk of your investment is in terms of your existing assets. But fundamentally, if you don't actively tackle your supply chains, you're not going to reduce your environmental impact. So there's a real challenge. And I think the way carbon accounting is developed is historically people don't disclose scope 3 emissions because it's the hard to tackle. Increasingly, there is going to be a focus, particularly from investors, around how you're planning to tackle those indirect emissions.
Great, thank you for that. There's one specific question for you, Rose, from Dermot Barnes, which is, it's about funding for the scope 3 transformation. Is there anything you can help us with on that?
So I think where predominantly the sector is, the challenge is we've predominantly all stress tested the financial impact of decarbonising our homes, and very few of us are at a stage where we're bringing it into the business plan. We have tested that and looked at, okay, what's the impact on our business plan and can we continue developing? I think in terms of the longer term funding perspective, we've been very clear as a business, this is not going to come solely down to government funding. Absolutely, there's going to be a myriad of solutions which will include your ESG credentials and ability to secure sustainability linked funding. There is going to be an element of government funding. And there is a piece around actually what else can the sector do to mitigate some of these costs. So I think, predominantly no one has an out and out solution to how are we going to fund this, but I would encourage strongly for leads on this agenda to not go down the route of it's all about lobbying for government funding, because fundamentally it's not going to happen. The other aspect with this, if you think about the quantum in terms of UK housing stock, the Climate Change Committee were estimating around 300 billion to tackle all UK housing. And the question there is, actually, what's the opportunity for this sector in terms of mobilising and driving regional solutions and greater delivery, given our ability to demonstrate that we can scale up and deliver major retrofit programmes historically? So a suite of answers there, but I guess what I'm saying, there isn't an answer, but look to the opportunity as well as the challenge.
Yeah, good. Just very briefly on that theme, Paul Smith has said, isn't things like decarbonising the supply chain the responsibility of the companies in that supply chain who are subject to legislation? So is it really our concern?
So it is a responsibility, but ultimately there's a responsibility to work with your supply chain, working with your existing suppliers to try and align where you can to your ambitions, but equally looking at your strategy for new suppliers. So I would strongly urge people to look towards the World Economic Forum initiative for supply chain decarbonisation, which is really about driving a collaborative approach to actually benefiting your business in terms of getting that alignment, but equally increasing transparency, working more directly. So it's not directly your responsibility, but it is directly related to some of the risks that you will encounter.
I'm presuming another question came in on this. The emissions generated by tenants, presumably you're counting those as scope 3 as well.
Yes, we are. So we're categorizing that as scope 3 because obviously we're not directly in control of the energy use within the home, albeit we're in control of the home itself. So yes, we do categorize as scope 3.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. There's more questions coming in, but I think we'll go to Ted next, and maybe Ted will pick up some of those themes. So Ted is the Director of Strategic Asset Management at Orbit, which is one of the largest social landlords in the country. He's been there since 2016, and he has an interesting background from not just from housing, but from other sectors, including BT, Barclays, and Severn Trent Water. And he's also set up a property and business performance specialist organization. So Ted, really interested to hear what you've got to say, and perhaps you'll pick up on some of the themes that have been discussed so far.
Thank you, James, and good morning. I'd like to build on a couple of points that the speakers already have mentioned. Robert mentioned that notion of really thoughtfully starting this journey. I'd like to build as well on what Rose was saying about that real focus on business transformation and a focus on reporting, because as you'll see, those things are terribly important. So first slide, please. Okay, a little bit about Orbit first. So 45,000 assets, about 81% of that to an EPCC minimum. But this all started, this journey for Orbit started shortly after a response to the Kyoto Protocol. So in the early noughties, this was about carbon. We then came through to about 2008, 2009, and actually this morphed at that point in time to a journey about fuel poverty. So actually the driver was never really about net zero carbon until recently. And what you can sense is that these key dates now, you can sense the pressure of these key dates down the side of the slide, where there's an action required, a response required now to that need to contribute to the UK's target around net zero carbon by 2050. Now, there's going to be a growing requirement, as Rose mentioned, to really report with clarity as to the action being taken to reduce carbon. A lot of green bonds, you'll see, are ratcheted on performance around carbon. So absolute clarity around this is really important. So what this little slide deck, about 6 slides, what this little slide deck talks to is some of those things that your board might well be asking you to think about as you start off on your journey. A number of the people on this call will be well through that journey already. Okay, next slide, please. So the first thing I want to talk about, and both Robert and Rose have touched on this, is something about standards. Now, I don't think that many of us will be pushing compressed data that comprises a digital image without understanding that there was someone who set a standard. And actually, the Joint Photographic Experts Group created that standard. We wouldn't be sharing digital images if that hadn't happened. And ISO, which curiously stands for the International Organization for Standards, which feels like it's the wrong way around, but there we are, have actually said that a standard is a formula that describes the best way of doing something. So I think it's a great question for your board to say, fine, so what does net zero carbon actually mean? What's the standard that you're going to push towards? And presently what you'll find is, in terms of kilowatt hours per square metre per annum, you'll see that the heat demand for, say, passive house might be no more than 15 kilowatt hours per metre per annum. But you might find that the latest funding that's been made available by BEIS will allow you to think about 90 kilowatt hours per square metre per annum. So that very, very initial point, what is the standard that you're going to step off from on this journey? Where is your compass point aiming? Because 1 degree of separation from that stepping off point, and you're going to end up in a very, very different place, perhaps to where you want to be in 30 years' time in 2050. So next slide, please. Okay, so you've got your standards sorted and you're starting that journey. But actually, what is the what's the carbon content of a kilowatt hour of grid electric? So as James mentioned, we're moving towards grid electric. We're moving away from gas for the problems relating to CO2. Now, I had a quick look at 8:55 this morning, where I'm on this webinar speaking to you today from. It's a pretty gloomy day. And presently, 43% of the input to every kilowatt hour of grid electric that's being pulled today is from burning things. Now, it might be burning biomass, it might be burning gas, it also includes burning coal. So actually, the carbon content of grid electric is pretty intensive still. Today, I'm looking out of the window wherever you're living right now, solar is contributing 0.9%. So we've really got to think about what we're going to tell the board about the rate of grid decarbonisation, because actually that's a really important point. You know, rough and tough, half of what we're doing today in terms of grid electric is from burning things. That isn't, I don't think, what people envisage. Now, furthermore, as we push, and again, we've mentioned this already on the webinar, as we push towards grid electric, we've got to bear in mind, and Robert said this in the earlier slides, EDF, something like 350% more expensive to draw a kilowatt off of electric than off of gas. And what you'll find is the standing charges tend to be higher as well. So the risk here is that we're pushing our residents into fuel poverty, as Rose has mentioned. So something really holistic needs to be borne in mind before we move through that standard. So the next slide, please. Now, your board will know that delivering strategy is only really possible when everything is aligned behind it. But at the moment, and a lot of the work that Orbit is doing is in some sensitive locations perhaps, but external wall insulation may very well need planning consent. Now, as we've touched on already, there's 29 million houses that will need something in the UK in the coming 27 years or so. There'll be something required to those houses. Is the planning system enabled to deal with 27 million planning applications just for those requirements? Second of all, think about VAT, because you could have two houses immediately alongside each other, one 6-month-old, one brand new. The same works done to those homes attract completely different levels of VAT. And yet this is a strategic matter for the UK to get to net zero carbon. So there's a big frictional tax on existing stock. And again, if you're thinking this through, by 2050, I think it's a well-known stat that roughly 80% of the homes that exist in 2050 exist now. So this is really about retrofit, and this VAT penalty is a real conundrum. And then finally, and again, we've touched on this, those 29 million homes, they're probably going to need maybe 26 million homes. They're going to need something. They're going to need something by 2050. So if we assume that's rough and tough 1 million homes a year, at a time when we're struggling to build 300,000 new ones, the supply chain has got to respond to that demand. So if we touch into things like air source heat pumps, the capacity for installs at the moment probably runs at no more than about 30,000 units a year. So the stimulus into the supply side has to be really significant. And so our strategy here needs to be all-encompassing around a number of different factors. And what we'll find is that the skills, the labour available, is also going to be incredibly short supply. So next slide, please. Okay, you've navigated some of those hazards. Your compass point is set. You're pretty confident, but actually, this table is actually from a really good house builder. And what you're looking at there is an EPC B home that has PV and probably has battery storage as well. So you'll see the heat demand has been moderated, so something like 969 kilowatt hours per annum. But to Rose's point about scope 3, that home is still pulling 5,600 kilowatt hours from the grid. You know, you look at that, you look at the domestic appliances, particularly refrigeration, those appliances are pulling energy from the grid. Is that what you're going to be telling your bond investors? Is that the message you're going to give around ESG about that 5,600 kilowatt hours? And there is also a really difficult point here. around people that find themselves in fuel poverty. This point that Jack Monroe kind of made in this last quarter is the potential that poverty has to draw more poverty. So what you'll find is that an A++ rated, say, tumbler dryer requires only about half of the energy of the average tumbler dryer, but it's extremely expensive to go and buy something like that. So again, people trapped into this kind of poverty position are actually going to be buying assets. They're going to consume more and more energy, more and more carbon, and actually more and more cost. And we need to think about how we can help people, as Rose mentioned, in that sort of transformation as to what we are as businesses. And so finally in this little slide deck, it may very well be that when you're faced with this level of uncertainty, that you might well think about, if you like, a core and contingent approach. So what's the core of what we're looking at right now? The no regrets area, and it has to be perhaps fabric first. If we can choke back the demand for energy in heating a home, if we can choke back, therefore, the amount of carbon, if we can create an asset that might well be able to be fueled by alternative fuel sources, that's got to be a no regrets position. It's also remarkably expensive in some instances. Robert's slide made that very, very clear. In some instances, it may be prohibitively expensive. There's going to be a very interesting discussion here about the cost of embedded carbon in the instance of an asset being regenerated. Then let's see about the innovation that's going to come in stage 2 around heating sources. So we're already seeing air source heat pumps that can produce much, much warmer water. So it may very well be that we haven't got to rip out existing radiators, existing pipework, and put massive radiators in place as we retrofit homes that will almost certainly cover up every 13 amp socket in the house that needs you to rewire the house as well, hence the incremental approach on costs. But those new technologies are going to take a while to bed in. And then finally, around this area, what you'll find is the government probably are envisaging, and if you read the Energy White Paper from the autumn, they're envisaging that their intervention presently with funding is actually to stimulate the supply chain, to get the costs down. It isn't necessarily to intervene in our business models. Our business models are probably something they're less interested in. What they want to see is that stimulated response from the supply chain. That's particularly relevant through all these steps. And then finally, as I've mentioned, with that 5,600 kilowatt hours, there is something to do to offset to get to net. So this staged approach might be around core and contingent positions, something that you end up discussing with your board members. But James, just in handing back to you, we do need to think about how we lobby, how we arrange the things that need to be arranged to make this as smooth. It's going to be very disruptive, but we make it as smooth a transformation of business models as we possibly can through to 2050 to really avoid that 1 degree of separation that could end with us being in a very, very different place to the one we're envisaging as we sit here today.
Ted, thank you very much for that. They're really thought-provoking. On a scale of 1 to 10, Ted, would you call yourself an optimist in this respect? Looking to 2050.
I think there is yeah, 8, maybe 8.5.
8.
Good. I do think this could be, to Rose's point, this could be transformational for the UK in terms of the type of jobs we could create, the type of technology we could create, the ability perhaps even to introduce at the same time, given the limitations of the grid, some electric vehicle charging. So I think it's a genuinely transformational opportunity we simply can't pass by.
And just to stick with you for a moment, Ted, on the kind of lobbying together as a sector point, I mean, we do have, we have representative bodies, we have professional bodies. Would it be fair to say that you'd like to see that being ramped up a bit, so turn up the dial on the intensity of lobbying? Because there's a lot going on here, isn't there?
There's an awful lot going on here, and I think it's really important to be able to explain the practical impact of the way people are thinking right now, because actually what you'll find is that really good lobbyists right now are very influential in terms of setting government policy. And I'm not sure as a sector with a single voice that we've necessarily achieved the same outcome right now.
Yeah, well, we see quite powerful interests asking for fracking, the ban on fracking, to be reversed, so that shale gas would be taken from the United Kingdom. So that's probably something we wouldn't be in favour of, but it's an example of effective lobbying in this area. Okay, so let's move on to the general discussion. First of all, thank you to all three speakers. I think that gave us a really good look at a mixture of the practical and the high level issues, what people are doing. I was really interested to hear about the kind of cultural transformation underway at Abri, the realistic view that Ted has expressed of the practical difficulties, and the data-based view that Robert offered. We've got quite a lot of questions about the fuel poverty issue. So I think I'd like to start with that, because it's obviously really important. I mean, we know that energy prices are likely to go up very substantially in April. There is a kind of moral hazard point here about, is it right that the poorest people in society should actually end up paying for decarbonisation when actually it's the richer people in society who have perhaps caused the problem? So let's get some thoughts about the link between the decarbonisation we're talking about and the tackling fuel poverty, particularly at the current moment. Robert, you've had the longest to wait since you spoke. Do you want to give us some thoughts about what can social landlords do to tackle their decarbonisation challenge, but in a way that doesn't unfairly disadvantage their tenants or create increased poverty for them?
Thanks for giving me that question, James.
Wow.
I think it's. I think the premise behind the question is a good one, and I don't have a profound answer. The best answer I would express is, I do think the sector needs to be very cautious, and one of my favourite phrases is "hurry up and wait." And I do think we run the risk. And I think I may have touched on this before, but we run the risk of, if we're getting our, to steal Ted's phrase, if we have our compass a few degrees set incorrectly, we may end up causing more trouble for our residents and not achieve very much. So I think the question is, for boards and execs, you need to be balancing both of these, decarbonisation amongst the other pressing issues that the sector faces. So that's the best answer I have, because I think it's a reasonable question.
Oh, good. Rose, you spoke a bit about fuel poverty, and we've got a couple of questions here. How can we make sure that these changes are being done with our tenants rather than to our tenants? Question from Sarah Cole.
Yeah, so I think this is really, really challenging. I think just going back to the issue of fuel poverty, the point we've got to be aware of is at the peak of fuel costs being, exacerbated by the price cap, the government will shift the levies to incentivise the adoption of clean heat. And what that's effectively going to do is move the deck chair. So customers won't benefit from that. They will kind of see no change. They will just have immensely high fuel costs. So I think in answer to the first part, I completely agree with Robert. I think rushing into a programme of clean heat is really risky at this stage in terms of fueling fuel poverty risks. I think in answer to the second part of that, how do we bring our customers on board? Abri's been very clear that we need to develop a really robust customer engagement strategy. And we've actually taken the view that we don't want to engage customers purely on the issue of the property. So we've taken a view that we want to have a much broader conversation with our customers about the implications of climate change. So we've actually just done a national survey looking at perceptions, barriers around climate change. And we're about to launch a campaign with our customers, which is all about having a broader conversation about climate change and then drilling into what it means for your home and what are the challenges that we're trying to address. So really trying to engage customers much more broadly rather than just making it about, let's talk to you about retrofit. But I think how we engage our customers and being transparent on what this means in terms of some of the challenges around fuel poverty is really, really key to this agenda.
And there's a knock on here in terms of the current prominence about mold and condensation issues. And we hear so much about maintenance staff going around and telling tenants, you've got to open the windows.
Yeah, so the Housing Ombudsman report on this made a very, very clear point. You cannot attribute damp and mold to lifestyle. It's not a lifestyle choice if you can't afford to heat your home. That's, views that fundamentally need to be eradicated. What we're doing is we're actively targeting programs. We're trying to remove the most inefficient heating systems in our stock within an accelerated period to try and proactively tackle the damp and mold issues. But the reality is, as fuel costs rise, damp and mold cases across your housing portfolio are set to increase. So there needs to be a strategic review of how do you tackle that rather than just a response maintenance. Okay, we go out at the point of that happening. So I think that's a real emerging issue in the sector.
It really is. Ted, what thoughts might you have on the whole fuel poverty kind of moral hazard question?
I think, James, we launched a paper last autumn, first research paper that Orbit had done for a short while. And what we've found is of the 1,000 respondents, so it's quite a big survey base, a quarter of those respondents had already had, do I heat or do I eat? So even at the old tariffs, this is probably a piece of research done in the spring and summer last year, people are extremely stretched. And as we enter the spring, and we know the tariffs are going to change and the cap's going to rise, we're going to have real issues across this. And we do have this paradox, James. We have this paradox that some of the poorest performers in terms of energy, some of those poorest performers, 19 million of our homes are D and below in the UK. Some of those poorest performers are going to have the people who are most straitened financially. Rose is quite right. The Energy White Paper last autumn made it perfectly clear that tariff-wise, there was going to be attention paid to making energy affordable for folk. But again, I don't know how much lobbying followed that, James, to get clarity on what that point actually means and what the proposals could be. So again, we just need to push through these discussions to understand, the author of that report, what was on their mind, what were they thinking, what's going to happen next.
Maybe we can circulate the web link to the report you mentioned, Ted.
Yes.
For participants. I think that would be good. Okay, well let's move on, but to a sort of linked area. We've had a couple of questions about mixed tenure blocks, about dealing with shared ownership providers and so on. It's a little bit of a kind of specialist area, but let's tackle those, because I think the problem of mixed ownership blocks with leaseholders and tenants and perhaps shared owners as well is quite a practical one, isn't it? Rose, is that something you've come across at Abri?
It is. I mean, I think the starting point, and particularly for Abri and many others in the sector, our shared ownership portfolios are relatively newer in build date. So actually, on the scale of retrofit, require predominantly less intervention. I think where we've got the issue of leaseholders, that's really, really challenging. And I think what we're finding for us and in the sector, actually we're in a piloting phase at the moment, and predominantly that's not including tackling mixed blocks, because there just isn't a solution at this stage in terms of apportionment. So it is really, really challenging. It's something we are also talking to BEIS about, from the perspective of, it's not just where we've got kind of mixed blocks, what happens where you've got terrace properties, where there's a private owner sat in between, you're looking at EWI solutions. So this goes back to my point at the beginning, there does need to be some sort of regional alignment to drive region-based solutions that work across private ownership and social housing, because it's a real difficult issue in the sector at the moment. So at this stage, we're really just trying to open up the conversation to say, how can we make this work as a sector?
Robert, do you have any, and does any of your data cover the particular problem of shared ownership and mixed tenure blocks? And
I wouldn't say the data. I mean, you once you know what you own, which is a challenge of itself in some occasions to work out, what the assets are, who your neighbours are, etc., etc. And I don't disagree with Rose's summary. I think it is a tricky area, but I go back, if I may, to what I hinted at, which is I think you should be looking at those assets and you should be asking yourself the question, are these the right assets for us to be owning in 15 years' time? Because you may be looking at that problem and it may be that the solution is is this something where we should be retrofitting in year 10 when the technology allows it, or you have some clarity, or are these assets, what is the right solution for this? And if you look at it strategically, you can take away a little bit of the stigma of problem with property A, B, C, and D, and you start to look at it in a bit more of an holistic manner. So I would raise the question that those sorts of issues will come up at the portfolio level, and you may be able to resolve the challenges in that way, at that level.
Okay, well, while you're talking, Robert, and sort of linked topic really, I think, I've worked in property for a long time, and private landlords are much more likely to churn stock than housing associations. They hold stock for perhaps 5 or 7 years on average, and then they trade it on. Same in care homes. One of the implications of some of what you said is that housing associations should be thinking more carefully about what they should get rid of, what they should dispose of. But of course, that is perhaps kicking the can down the road for somebody else. So again, there's a bit of moral hazard there. So again, your thoughts on that would be really welcome.
I'll try very hard to give a short answer, because I think it's a very, very good topic. The first is, if I read it or understood it correctly, I won't pretend to have read all of it, but the Levelling Up paper brought in effectively decent home standards to private landlords as well. So I think some of the data that Ted mentioned about, aiming to retrofit 1 million homes a year to 2050, we haven't talked about the competitive landscape where the private sector and the good private sector landlords, and let's remember that there's a spectrum of ownership there, they're going to be competing to carry out these positive changes. You'll have a sector of private sector landlords who'll be doing everything they can to avoid it, and that's something that we need to be mindful of. I raise that because I think your question about kicking the can down the road is, if you are choosing to dispose of your properties, I think that's only the first step of a pathway. I think it's really important for RPs to ask themselves the question, what condition are they in? To whom do we sell it? Do we do some works to bring them up to a decent home standard? Do we focus on first home buyers? Do we focus on shared ownership solutions for existing residents? There's a whole layer of strategic choices embedded within that category that can be an area where you can bring and minimise that moral hazard question that you're raising. And I think good boards and good execs, when they come up with their portfolio strategies, will consider those questions.
Yeah. Ted, not to put you on the spot, but is disposal one of the tools in your armoury for Orbit?
Yes, it is. So what we will do though is have a standard around what a good social home is. And what we will do is measure the performance of an asset against that standard. We will, I guess to coin a phrase, strain every sinew to try and make sure that if we cannot get an asset to the right standard, that the property is sold, as Robert suggests, in a way that minimises that moral risk. I guess when all's said and done though, James, it does start with standards. That if we're putting people into homes which would not otherwise be fit or fit for purpose, we have to consider whether that actually of itself is the right thing to do in the first instance. Coming back to those stats right across the construction and property industry, we've put 19 million people or 19 million households into homes that are D and below.
Yeah. And I guess in some parts of the country, you can sell a Victorian property to a prosperous young couple who will spend £500,000 doing it up. Problem solved. And you can put the money back into developing new homes. Rosie, is disposal big on the Abri agenda?
Yes, I mean, all of our stock is categorised in terms of retain, dispose, regen, potential transfer. I think the point to think about when you talk about disposals, though, is in the longer term, it's very likely that regulation is going to prevent you disposing of highly inefficient stock, or equally stamp duty is probably going to reflect energy efficiency. So there will be market mechanisms that mean that actually in the long term, just disposing of your inefficient stock is probably not going to be a viable option. So we have approached this from the perspective of, we will increase our disposal programs, but actually we're not assuming that all of that is just energy inefficient stock, because there will be restrictions on that in the longer term.
And question from Adam Broadway, I'll stick with you, Rose, for a moment. Do we think that the regulator is going to pick up on all of this and start setting down standards that we have to follow and reporting in terms of the housing regulation? Is that something on the horizon, do you think?
I think what potentially is on the horizon is the regulator looking particularly at whether people are bringing decarbonisation costs into their business plan. I think that's where this will become an issue, because this whole issue of most people are stress testing, it's not material in their business plan. Do I think they'll come into the broader standards? I would question probably not. They will get up to the panelists, but I think the thing to think about is, when is the regulator going to start expecting to see those costs in your business plan? That's probably the more immediate issue.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Ted, any thoughts on that?
No, I agree with Rose there, James, that the process of stress testing business plans to ensure that the requirements that we can see through 2050 can be met, I think that process is probably going to start very shortly.
Yeah, good. Okay, quite a lot of questions have come in. I don't know if we're going to be able to tackle them all. Some slightly more detailed ones about the EPCs and the new exclusions related to costs, and whether that is going to be useful for social landlords. That was a question from Isaac Alfon. Rose, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally with EPCs, there are a whole manner of issues at the moment, particularly the fact that if you actually go and install electric heating or air source heat pumps, your EPC ratings are going to go down. So I think there's going to be a whole cycle over the next few years of EPCs generally being looked at. Do I think, and I don't claim to be an expert on this area, do I think it overly benefits landlords at this stage? I think there are just too many challenges generally with EPCs and the SAP methodology that actually all of it's a bit of a barrier at this stage. But again, welcome, Ted, particularly you'll have thoughts on this as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ted.
So I think if you open up an EPC certificate, the first diagram says effectively what it's going to cost to run. The diagram, if you go through the EPC paperwork, the diagram at the back tells you what the carbon picture is going to be. It speaks back to an older set of building regulations, and is due to be refreshed and replaced very, very shortly. So I think it's going to be quite volatile. For a long time, people would have rushed out to get the additional 6 SAP points by fitting a gas condensing boiler, because that might just flip a marginal D into a C. So if a good tax nudges the right behaviour, then that is, I think, where we need to start looking as a sector. So what is the right stimulus to create the right behaviour? And I think it's quite interesting that the rebates that were spoken of last week or week before, I think it's £150 off of bills, is related to council tax banding and not to the energy performance of the asset. So again, the opportunity to have nudged the behaviour has lost, because you can't really affect the capital value of the asset, whereas you could have made the assets more energy efficient. This whole area needs to be, I think, substantially rethought.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned VAT as well, and I thought that was very powerful. I mean, that's probably quite a priority in terms of lobbying for government, because, as you say, it's a major disincentive, isn't it? Or it's a major drag on cost, at least.
And James, could be a real irony that someone that's bought a new home, the next door neighbour's home is specified with those energy efficient, energy reducing technologies, but because they bought it, they've got to pay the VAT. It's a real drag. It's a friction on doing the right thing, and doing the right thing is about that 80% of the stock that's still going to be there in 2050.
Yeah. Good. Robert, I know you're not an expert on these matters, but you are today. The whole question of EPCs and how they work and whether that creates kind of perverse incentives, what changes would you like to see?
You're right, I'm not an expert. And I find myself agreeing with Ted, but I'd agree in more blunt terms, which is it's a very arbitrary mechanism. It's a very arbitrary document. And you listen to Rose and her brilliant graphic, which I'm going to study hard on, the scope 1, 2, and 3, and asking yourself, what does the EPC actually reveal? And then I think you have to, as execs and boards, have the fiendishly difficult challenge of working out how they navigate around it and not be trapped by, I won't say a lazy reliance on a single document, but it won't be that simple. And I think I'm just agreeing again with Ted's opening comments about standards. It can be a very, very nasty shield to delivering what you're trying to deliver.
Yeah, and there's a follow-on question in effect from Niall Sheridan, which is, is there a risk here that we're all going to be in such a hurry to reach certain standards in the next 5 minutes that we end up putting untried technology that doesn't work as well, and that we actually need to wait a bit until it works better? So, I think, was it you, Robert, that said, let's hurry up and wait?
Yeah, yes. This question, very, very easy question to answer, I'm afraid. Oh, that's my fear anyway. I think time will help us all on this one.
But nonetheless, there is urgency to get going now, isn't there?
I mean, and there's a lot of work to be done. And Ted's numbers of 1 million homes a year for 20 years. But RPs, I think, the effort required to understand their portfolio and really know what the right choices will be. And all of this is difficult, it's subjective, and you have choices to do with, single assets or large groups of assets. There's an enormous amount of work to get to the position where you can make informed choices. So the hurry up and wait is, from my perspective, is wait for the technology and some of the works. I think on new development, there's exciting things you can do on innovation in the meantime, but it's really understand your portfolio, because only then can you start to answer the questions. And to go back to the figures, do you have a £3,000 problem on property A, or is it a £40,000 problem?
Yeah.
These are things you really need to know.
Yeah, Dermot Barnes has commented, we don't have time to wait, we've got to get on with it. Ted, are you up for waiting a bit, or do you just want to get on with it?
What we found is, I think Dermot's right, because the carbon we produce is going to be hanging around in the atmosphere for probably hundreds of years to come. So there is this real imperative to get on with it. That's absolutely understandable. But what we found is that for a lot of our customers, gas boilers have been around for 150 years. People understand how they work. They understand how to operate them. They understand intuitively how to operate their homes. And I think what we found is that some of the early air source heat pump technology, people just haven't been able to adapt to, actually. So we do need to, that education, that sounds a bit pious, but that program of working with our customers to help them understand how to use this technology is really, really important. So we've got to lockstep this together, I think, between how our customers want to operate their buildings and making it really easy for that transformation, that transition to happen.
Yeah, great, thank you. I've had a comment here that the National Energy Foundation are organising something in Whitehall on Thursday to campaign for the abolition of VAT on retrofits. So all of us need to be there, I think, waving our placards. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to rerun the poll and just see if the views of people have shifted, having heard the conversation. Then I'm going to ask each of the participants to give us their final views, really, about the way forward, and then we'll bring it to an end. So here we are with the same questions again. Let's see. I'm particularly interested in the 2%, actually, who strongly agreed that they were absolutely ready. But let's see what people have got to say. Doesn't take long. Oh, the 2% is still there. Yeah, I think the numbers have shifted a bit, nonetheless. I think people are we've shaken people up a bit, I'm afraid, folks. They're less certain than they were in terms of how ready they are. So that's really interesting. And I think it's actually a tribute to the speakers that they've helped people to really confront those issues in terms of thinking about their own organizations. So what we'll do now is we'll go in the reverse order for the initial speakers to bring us to an end, which is a couple of minutes each. Ted, do you want to give us your parting thoughts, having participated in the seminar?
No, thank you, James. And I do think we need to think about standards.
Mm-hmm.
I do think we need to think about how to change. So it's not just the transformational change that Rose mentioned that our businesses need to go with, but actually the property and construction industry and the round. So we know that the world's third biggest carbon producer is the cement industry. So we need to think about those scope 3 inputs, and also how to help others change, be it Treasury in terms of VAT, be it supply chain partners in terms of taking the risk of actually starting to scale up to deliver what we need delivering at scale at a sensible price. The government, I think, are hoping that once the industry is scaled up, the costs of getting to net zero carbon will be significantly lower. And also, I think the final piece of change is then around our customers, that actually operating an asset with new technology in it, given that we know that gas boilers have been around for 150 years and people are intuitive with them, the ability of customers to be able to operate these assets is fundamentally important. So we need as well to help our customers make those changes too. So for me, James, if I was going to summarize that, I think it's recognizing that this is transformational change. It's driven out of standards. It's driven out of really good comms, really good lobbying, and really understanding who we need to talk to and when.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ted. Rose, you're next.
Yeah, thank you. So I agree. I mean, I think from the standards perspective, as an organisation, you fundamentally need to understand how much of your investments tackling fuel poverty versus transitioning to net zero. I think a key element of your strategy needs to be about understanding the risks that climate change present, both physical and transitional, and looking towards a more sophisticated approach. And then for me, I guess the final strand is, really readying your business for where financial markets are going, and investor expectations will be really, really key when we're talking about how we're going to fund this. So making sure that forms part of a holistic approach to readying your organisation is really, really key.
Thank you, Rose. I think one of my top takeaways from today was the 97% point. So thank you for that as well. Robert, last word to me, but second last word to you.
I'm glad you have the last word, and I echo very much what Rose and Ted have said, but I think strategy is about choice. So the strategic question is, there are some very difficult choices over the next, 18 years to 2050. And what's come through with some of the questions and some of the things that worry me is, for the boards and execs at housing associations, you have your residents and their needs, and weighing them up very carefully against decarbonisation. There are some difficult choices there, and I think you need to have mind to, like you, James, Rose's points on the scope 3 and the scale of the challenge. I think we just need to calibrate the strategy very, very carefully to keep those. To keep the residents at the forefront, and better homes, which I think is also something which is embedded in the strategic choice.
Great, thank you very much. And that brings us, with 1 minute to spare, to our closing point of 11:15. So this is the moment at which normally there would be a round of applause, and you would be able to go home with the applause ringing in your ears, speakers, but that is not to be today. But I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of the audience for sharing with us so openly how you've been tackling the issues, how you're approaching it, what the top things are in terms of your worries. My other top takeaway is Ted saying that he's an 8 out of 10, 8.5 out of 10 optimist. And I think we all need to be optimistic, because this is such an important problem. It's going to be with us for the rest of our lives and for our grandchildren's lives, and we have to do something. And it's good to hear that it's starting. So thank you again very much, and thank you to the audience for listening, and see you next time.